In the spring of 1887, in the high country above the Bitterroot Valley of Montana Territory, a woman named Hannah Reyes stood at the foot of a mountainside that had tried to bury a house, and she counted the stones she would have to move with her own 2 hands. There were thousands of them. Some were the size of a fist, and some were the size of a freight wagon, and the men who had ridden up to watch her take possession of the wreck had already decided she would not move a single one. She had paid $11 for the cabin and the quarter-acre it sat under, which was $11 more than anyone in the town of Stamper's Crossing believed the ruin to be worth. The auctioneer had called it a courtesy sale, a way of clearing a dead man's debt off the county books, and he had laughed when she raised her hand. A Rockslide cabin, they called it, a grave with a deed. What none of them knew, and what she did not tell them, was that she had not come for the cabin at all. She had come for what the stones were hiding, and she had a way of knowing where a door should be even when she could not see it. Stay with me, because the mountain had kept its secret for 9 years, and the man who put it there was counting on no one ever caring enough to dig. Hannah was 28 years old that spring, and she had arrived in Stamper's Crossing with a canvas bag, a mule named Pard, and a set of mason's tools wrapped in oilcloth that were the only inheritance her life had given her. She was not a large woman. She stood a little over 5 feet, with forearms hardened by a trade most people did not believe a woman could keep, and she had the steady, assessing way of looking at a thing that made men uneasy without their quite knowing why. Her father had been a stonemason in the mining camps of Colorado, a Welshman who had crossed an ocean and a continent to set granite for other men's fortunes, and he had taught her the craft from the time she was old enough to hold a chisel without dropping it on her foot. He had taught her that stone was not an enemy. He had taught her that every wall has a logic, that a mountain that comes down along lines a patient eye can read, and that the difference between a laborer and a mason is that the laborer fights the stone while the mason listens to it. "There is no quarrel with granite," he used to say, "only a conversation, and the man who shouts at it loses." He would set her hand against a block and make her wait until she could feel where the grain ran, where the natural cleft lay hidden under the skin of the rock, and only then would he let her lift the hammer. Most days she split nothing, and only learned to feel. The splitting, he told her, was the easy part, and any fool with a strong back could break a stone the wrong way. The hard part was knowing where it wanted to break, and that was a thing you learned with your hands and your patience, and never with your strength. He had been a quiet man, dust-coughed and proud, who set granite for the courthouses and bank fronts of richer men, and was paid a laborer's wage for a master's eye, and he had borne the injustice of it without complaint, because complaint, he said, was a kind of shouting at the stone. The injustice had not been lost on Hannah. She had watched men who could not tell a load-bearing course from a decorative one give her father orders, and she had learned early that the world would judge the work of her hands by the size of those hands and the name attached to them, and that the only answer to such judgment was work too good to be argued with. He had died of the dust in his lungs the winter Hannah turned 19, coughing in a boarding-house bed while she held a basin and could do nothing, and the last clear thing he had said to her was that she should never let a man tell her what she could not lift. She had carried that sentence the way other people carried a locket. She had buried him with his own trowel in his folded hands and kept the chisels, and she had set out west alone, because a stonemason goes where the stone is, and there was more stone in the territories than in all the cemeteries of Colorado. The cabin had belonged to a man named Elias Crane, and Elias Crane had been dead for 9 years, and the manner of his living and dying was the first thing Hannah set out to learn once the deed was folded into her satchel. The town was glad enough to tell her because telling it cost them nothing, and they expected her to be gone within the week. Crane had come to the valley in the late 70s with money nobody could account for, had built himself a tight cabin against the mountain's shoulder where no sensible person would build, and had kept to himself in a way the valley found both insulting and suspicious. Then, one March the snowpack let go above his roofline, and a wall of rock and ice came down in the night. And when the thaw came, the cabin was gone under a slope of gray stone, with only one corner of the roof showing. No body was ever recovered. The county had ruled him dead, seized the land for unpaid assessment, and let the slide stand as his headstone. There was more, and the more was what interested her. Before he died, Crane had been in a dispute with the largest landholder in the county, a man named Wallace Doane, who owned the bank, the freight line, and the patience of most of the territorial officials a frontier county had to deal with. The nature of the dispute nobody in the saloon could say with confidence. Some said Crane owed Doane money, some said it ran the other way. The teller who finally spoke to her, a thin, nervous man named Pratt, said only that Crane had come into the bank a week before the slide and asked to see the original survey of his own land, and that Doane had told him the survey was lost, and that Crane had not believed him. Pratt told her this in the back of the mercantile after she had bought a sack of meal she did not need so that the talking would have a reason, and he kept his voice low and his eyes on the door the whole while. He had been a young clerk in the bank in those years, and he remembered Crane's visit because of how it had ended, with Crane standing very still at the counter and Doane coming out of his office to speak to him in a voice too quiet to carry, and Crane leaving without another word and never coming into the bank again. A week later, the mountain came down. Pratt did not say that the one thing had caused the other. He said only that he had thought about it every year since, and that he had never told anyone, because a man with a family does not say such things about the man who holds his note. Then he asked her, almost pleading, not to repeat that he had spoken to her at all, and Hannah told him plainly that she would not, and she kept that word as she kept all her words. Hannah listened to all of it and said little. She had learned from her father that you do not announce what you are looking for, because the announcing is how you lose it. She paid Pratt nothing and thanked him plainly, and walked back up the mountain in the long blue light of evening to look again at the stones. The slope was perhaps 40 feet of fallen rock, settled and locked by 9 years of gravity and frost into something that looked, to the men who had laughed at her, as permanent as the mountain itself. Hannah did not see permanence. She saw the way the larger boulders had come to rest against one another, and she saw the seams of shadow between them, and she began to understand that the slide had not crushed the cabin so much as it had sealed it. The roof corner that still showed was not collapsed, it was holding. Something underneath was holding the weight, which meant something underneath was still standing, and a structure that is still standing has an inside. She made her camp against the slope that night with Pard tethered to a lodgepole pine, and she did not sleep much, and in the morning she began to move the stones. Here is the thing the men in town did not understand about what she did, and it is worth understanding because it is the whole of how she won. She did not start at the top and dig down, which is what a strong fool would have done and which would have brought the upper slope sliding onto her the moment she pulled the wrong rock. She walked the whole face first, for the better part of a day, laying her bare palm flat against the larger boulders and feeling for the cold ones and the warm ones, the ones that had sun heat in them because they bore no load, and the ones that stayed cold because the weight of the slope pressed through them. Her father had taught her that a loaded stone drinks the heat from your hand. She marked the cold ones with a smear of red ochre from a tin in her satchel, and by evening the slope wore a scattering of red marks that spelled out, to her eye, and to no one else's, the skeleton of how the mountain was carrying itself. Then she began to take the slope apart in the order the stones themselves dictated. The unloaded ones first, working sideways and downward along the lines of least resistance, never pulling a marked stone until she had relieved the ones leaning on it. It was slow beyond the patience of any spectator, and within 3 days the spectators had stopped coming. That suited her. She worked from first light to last, and she ate cold and slept hard, and her hands cracked and bled, and she wrapped them in strips of an old shirt and kept working. The mule hauled the smaller stones away on a stone boat she lashed together from cabin timber she found at the slope's edge. The larger ones she split where they lay, drilling the line of a seam with a star drill and a 4-pound hammer, setting her feathers and wedges into the holes the way her father had shown her, and tapping them down in sequence until the stone opened along the grain she had chosen for it. A boulder the size of a stove came apart under her hands in an afternoon, and she felt each time the old clean satisfaction of a thing yielding not to force but to understanding. There were setbacks, because there always are. On the 5th day, a stone she had read wrong shifted as she freed the one beside it, and the whole upper face groaned and settled 6 inches with a sound that stopped her heart in her chest, and a fist of rock came loose and struck her across the shoulder hard enough to put her on her knees in the scree. She knelt there a long moment, breathing, feeling the blood start warm under her shirt, and then she got up and did not curse the mountain, because cursing it would have been shouting, and she went back over the whole face with her ochre and her bare hand, and found the 2 stones she had misjudged and understood, finally, that the slope had a second skeleton beneath the first, an older slide the new one had come down on top of, and that she had been reading only the top layer. She marked the slope again. She had lost a day and gained the truth of how the thing was built, and her father would have called that a fair trade. She slept badly that night, the shoulders stiffening, and in the gray before dawn she lay listening to Pard crop the thin grass and thought about the man who had built a door to outlast a mountain. A frightened man does not build like that. A frightened man runs. The man who framed that doorway had been afraid of the wrong coming for him, surely, but he had also been certain enough of something to spend his last energy, making sure it would survive him, and Hannah found she wanted very badly to know what a dying man thought worth more than his own escape. She rose with the light and went back to the stone. On the 9th day she uncovered the door. It was where she had known it would be. She had read the standing corner of the roof, and worked back along the line a wall would have to follow, and she had been moving toward the spot for 2 days with the certainty of someone walking down a hallway in the dark of a house they grew up in. The door was oak, banded with iron, and it was shut, and it had been shut for 9 years under 40 feet of stone, and the lintel above it had held because Elias Crane had framed his doorway with the timbers of a man who expected the mountain to come down someday, and meant to be ready for it. She stood before it a long while. The light was going amber down the valley, and the iron bands were furred with rust, the color of dried blood, and behind that door was either nothing or the reason she had spent $11 and 9 days and the skin of both her hands. She set her palm against the wood. It was cold the way the loaded stones had been cold, which told her there was air behind it, a sealed and waiting space, and that the cabin had not filled with rubble after all. I want you to sit with what it took to stand at that door, because most people never get to find out whether the thing they believed was real. She lifted the latch. The door did not open at first. The frame had shifted under the load and pinched the door in its jam, and she did not force it, because forcing it might have brought down the lintel and the corner of roof and all the work and herself with it. Instead, she went back to the stone. She spent a full day easing the weight off the doorframe's left side, taking down a buttress of rock she had deliberately left standing because she had suspected it bore on the frame. And when she had relieved it, she came back to the door and tried the latch again, and the door swung inward on its hinges with a sound like a long breath let go. The air that came out of it was cold and dry and smelled of dust and old iron and something underneath that she could not name the particular still smell of a place where time has stopped. She lit her lantern and went in. The cabin stood whole inside its shell of stone. The slide had buried it, and the timbers had held, and the inside was exactly as a man had left it on a March night 9 years before. A table with a plate still on it, the food long since dried, to a dark stain and gone. A chair pushed back as though someone had risen in a hurry. A bunk against the wall, with the blankets thrown off. a cold stove with the ash still in it. Dust lay over everything, fine and gray and undisturbed, and in the still lantern light it hung in the air, where her movement stirred it, turning slowly, catching the flame. It was not a grave. It was a room that had been waiting. She moved through it slowly, setting each boot down with care, as though the place might break if she hurried it. On the wall above the bunk a coat still hung from its peg, the wool stiff with cold and time. A pair of spectacles lay folded on the table, beside the dried plate, the wire bent to the shape of a face no one would ever see again. On a shelf above the stove stood a row of survey instruments, a brass transit gone green with verdigris, a leather case of dividers, a plumb bob on its cord, the tools of a man who had spent his life measuring where the lines of things truly ran. Hannah lifted the spectacles and held them to the lantern and set them down again exactly where they had lain. She was not a sentimental woman, and she did not weep, and yet she felt the particular weight of standing in the last hour of a stranger's life. The supper he never finished, the bed he never lay back down in. She did not touch anything more at first. She stood in the middle of the room and let the lantern show her the shape of the life that had stopped here, and she felt the grave weight of it settle on her, the sense of a man caught mid-motion and held for 9 years in the dark. Then she did what her father would have done. She looked for the logic of the place. A man who built his door to survive a rockslide was a man who expected to lose everything but the door. So he would have kept what mattered where the structure was strongest. She found it in less than an hour. Behind the stove, set into the stone of the chimney base where the masonry was thickest and the heat would keep the damp out, was a small iron strong-box, mortared in place so that the stone itself was the lock. The mortar was Crane's own work, and it was poor work, the work of a man who knew what he wanted to do but had never learned the trade. And Hannah took it out in 20 minutes with a chisel and the side of her hammer, because removing another man's bad mortar without harming the stone around it was the first thing her father had ever taught her to do. The strongbox was not locked. There was no need. The mountain had been the lock. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth against the damp, were 3 things, and the 3 things together were the whole of why Elias Crane had died alone against a mountain, and why the town had been so willing to let his story end under a pile of gray stone. The first was the original government survey of the valley, the genuine one dated 1871, with the surveyor's seal and signature intact. The second was a hand-drawn map, Crane's own, comparing that original survey to the one the county had been using since 1878, and the comparison showed, in lines anyone could follow, that somewhere between those years the recorded boundary of the valley's water rights had moved. The third was a bundle of letters, and the letters were the proof, and the proof had a name on it, and the name was Wallace Doane. Hannah sat on the cold floor of the buried cabin, with the lantern beside her, and read the letters through twice. She was not a hasty reader, and she did not trust her own first understanding of a thing, so she went through them again, slowly, the way she would walk a slope before she touched it. By the end she understood what Crane had understood 9 years before, and she understood why he had asked the bank for the original survey, and she understood why the bank had told him it was lost. The valley's water came down from the high snowfields through a single creek, and whoever held the recorded right to that creek held the life of every farm below it. In 1871, the survey had placed the head gate and the senior water right on the upper quarter section, which had belonged, in 1871, to a homesteading family named Okafor, free people who had come west after the war and proved up their claim with 7 years of labor. In 1878, a new survey had appeared in the county records, and in the new survey the boundary had moved half a mile downstream, and the senior right now fell on land that Wallace Doane had bought for almost nothing the year before from a county that had declared the Okafor claim abandoned. The Okafor family had not abandoned anything. The letters, which were between Doane and a territorial clerk now long since moved on, made it plain that the abandonment had been manufactured, the notice posted where no one would see it, The family put off their own land by men who said the paper had changed. Elias Crane had been the surveyor's assistant in 1871. He had carried the chain and driven the stakes, and he had known the way only the man who measured it could know, exactly where the true line ran. He had spent years afterward, it seemed, troubled by what he had helped survey, and then watched be undone. And at the end he had gathered the proof and gone to the bank to confront the thing directly, and a week later the mountain had come down on him in the night. Whether the mountain had been helped, Hannah would never be able to prove, and she did not try. The letters were enough. The letters did not need a murder to be damning. She wrapped the 3 things back in their oilcloth, and she did not sleep that night either. And in the morning she did not ride down to the town and stand in the street and shout what she had found, which is what a person who wanted revenge would have done. She had not come for revenge. She had come, though she had not fully known it until she sat on that floor reading by lantern light to set a thing right that had been left wrong. And setting a thing right is slower and quieter work than tearing a thing down, and she knew the difference because she was a mason and not a powder man. The first person she went to was not the sheriff and not a judge. It was an old woman who lived at the lower end of the valley in a soddy with a good garden, a woman the town called Granny V and largely ignored, who had been in the valley longer than anyone and who, Hannah had learned in her week of quiet listening, had been a neighbor to the Okafor family before they were driven out. Hannah found her shelling beans on a bench in the morning sun, and she sat down beside her without being asked, and she said plainly that she had found something up at the Crane place that concerned the Okafors and the creek, and she asked the old woman where the family had gone. Granny V did not answer for a while. She shelled her beans and looked at this small, hard-handed woman who had moved a mountain, and at last she said that the youngest Okafor daughter, Ruth, had been a girl of 10 when they were put off the land, and that the family had gone south to the rail town, and that the parents were dead now, but that Ruth was living still, married. A woman grown with children of her own, no more than 2 days' ride away. She said it the way a person says a thing they have carried a long time and never expected to be asked about. Then she looked at Hannah and asked her, with the bluntness of the very old, what she meant to do with it. "I mean to give it back," Hannah said. That was all. The old woman shelled her beans a moment longer, and then she set the bowl down and said she would come along, because she had been a witness to the wrong, and she would be a witness to the righting of it, and because a thing like this should not be carried by one pair of hands alone. They rode south together, the small mason and the old woman, with the oilcloth bundle wrapped in oilskin against the weather, and Pard carrying the both of their provisions, and the going was slow, and Hannah did not push it. She had learned that the last stretch of a long work is the one most likely to be ruined by haste. On the second day they came to the rail town, and they found Ruth Okafor, now Ruth Bell, in a neat frame house on a street of working people, a tall woman in her middle 30s with her mother's bearing and 3 children underfoot, and Hannah laid the survey and the map and the letters on her kitchen table, and let the papers speak for themselves. Because she had also learned that a wronged person does not need to be told what was done to them. They need to be shown that someone else finally knows. Ruth Bell read the letters standing up, one hand flat on the table, and when she had finished, she sat down slowly and put her hand over her mouth and did not speak for a long time. Her oldest child, a boy of about 11, came and stood close against her side, and looked at the strangers with the wariness children learn early in families that have been moved off their land, and she put her arm around him without looking away from the papers. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, which cost her something, and she said only that her father had sworn to the day he died that they had not abandoned the claim, and that no one had ever believed him. Now there was paper that believed him. Now there was a dead surveyor's assistant and a mason who bought a grave for $11 who believed him. She told them then, in the plain way of a person who has carried a thing too long to dress it up, what the leaving had been. She had been 10. She remembered the man who came with the notice, and nailed it to their own door, and her father reading it again as though the words might rearrange themselves into sense, and the wagon they loaded in 2 days, because 2 days was what they were given. She remembered her father going to the county seat to stand in the office, and be told that the matter was settled and the paper was the paper, and coming home with his hat in his hands. He had been a man who believed that the law was a thing you could appeal to, that if you were only in the right and could say so clearly enough, someone would listen. The valley had taught him otherwise. He had died in the rail town, a tenant on another man's ground, a proving-up homesteader who had proved up and been robbed of the proving, and the bitterness of it had been, Ruth said, the only thing she ever knew to break him. Hannah listened to all of it, and did not interrupt, and did not offer comfort, because she had learned from her own grief that comfort offered too soon is only a way of asking the grieving to stop. She let Ruth say the whole of it. When Ruth was done, Hannah said that the land office in the capital was not the county seat, that the men there did not hold Doan's notes, and did not fear him, and that the genuine survey with its true seal was a thing even a bought official would find hard to explain away. She did not promise victory, because she did not make promises she could not keep with her own hands. She said only that the proof was real, and that she meant to carry it as far as it would go, and Ruth Bell looked at her across the kitchen table for a long moment, and then nodded once, the way her father might have, and said that she would come too. The writing of it took the better part of a year, and it did not happen the way a story would make it happen, with a single dramatic morning in a courtroom and a villain led away. It happened the way real restitution happens, in pieces through the patient stacking of one true thing on another. Hannah did not bring the papers to Wallace Doan's county, where his money had bought the patience of the officials, but to the territorial land office in the capital, where a clerk with no stake in the valley examined the 1871 survey and its seal, compared it to the altered record, and found that the seal and the surveyor's hand were genuine, and that the later survey bore alterations a trained eye could see. Ruth Bell filed the claim in her own name as her father's heir. Granny V swore a deposition to the manufactured abandonment. The posted notice no one was meant to see. The dead surveyor's assistant testified through his letters, which is the only way the dead can testify, and his testimony was the strongest of all because it was written before anyone knew it would be needed. The work of it fell in the main to Hannah because Ruth had 3 children and a husband on the rail and could not be traveling to the capital, and because Hannah had learned that a thing left to officials moves only when someone stands in the room and will not leave. She made the journey to the capital 3 times that year. She sat on hard benches in cold corridors and waited on clerks who did not want to be troubled, and she did not raise her voice, and she did not go away, and each time she brought the genuine survey wrapped in its oilcloth and laid it on the desk and let the seal speak. A surveyor general's man, an old engineer named Tate who had measured land himself before a desk took him, was the one who finally took the matter up in earnest, because he could see in the altered record the very thing a layman could not, the place where a draftsman's hand had changed a bearing and tried to match the old ink and failed. Tate had no love for Doan and no fear of him either, being too near retirement to be threatened, and he treated the forged survey as a personal affront to his trade. He became, without ever meaning to, the one credentialed voice the case required, and he gave it plainly and once and then let the paper carry the rest. Wallace Doan was never met in a courtroom by anyone in this story. That is not how men like Doan end. When the land office began its review and the genuine survey surfaced and the letters with his name on them were entered into the record, the foundation of paper he had built his holdings on began to come apart, quietly, and then all at once, the way a slope comes down. Other claims he had taken by the same method were reopened. The territorial officials who had been patient with him discovered the limits of their patience the moment his ruin stopped being profitable to ignore. He sold what he could and left the territory within the year, and Hannah never saw his face, and she found she did not need to. Her father had taught her that you do not have to fight a wall to bring it down. You have only to take away what it leans on. The senior water right returned to the upper quarter section and to Ruth Bell, and with it the valley below the creek understood, slowly, that the woman they had laughed at for buying a Rockslide had quietly handed them back the law that governed their own water. The men who had ridden up to watch her fail did not, in the main, come and apologize, because men of that kind rarely do, and Hannah did not wait for them to. The auctioneer who had called it a courtesy sale stopped her in the street one day and took off his hat, which he had not done when he sold her the deed, and said that he had been wrong about what the place was worth. She told him that he had not been wrong, that the cabin truly had been worth about $11, and that what it had been hiding was worth a great deal more, and the two of them were never the same thing. He thought about that, and put his hat back on, and that was the nearest thing to an apology the town produced, and it was enough. Ruth Bell offered Hannah money, a share of the water rights worth, and Hannah would not take it. She said that the right had never been hers to be paid for. What she took instead when Ruth pressed her, because Ruth was not a woman who could let a debt stand unanswered any more than her father had been, was a single thing from the buried cabin that the land office had no use for. It was Elias Crane's surveyor's chain, the actual iron chain he had carried in 1871 to measure the true line, 66 feet of linked iron, worn bright at the handles by a dead man's grip. Hannah kept it coiled in her satchel beside her father's chisels, 2 inheritances now, instead of 1, 2 dead men's tools carried by a living woman who knew what they were for. She had expected to when she rode in, but a mason who has proven she can read a mountain does not lack for work in a country built of stone, and the valley had decided, in its slow, grudging way, that it would rather have her than not. She took the $11 quarter-acre and she did not rebuild the cabin where Crane had died, because some places have given what they have to give and should be let alone. Instead, she cleared the last of the slide by hand over the following summers, stone by stone, and with the stone she built a low wall along the creek that the valley had nearly lost, and nearly lost the Okafors with it, a dry-laid wall of fitted granite that needed no mortar because every stone in it was chosen to bear the one above, the way her father had taught her, the way she had taught herself to read the slope that first day with her bare and bleeding hands. She worked at it in the evenings and on the Sundays when there was no paying work, and the wall grew slowly, a course at a time. Each stone turned in her hands until she found the face it wanted to show and the bed it wanted to sit in. The valley watched her build it and did not understand at first why a woman would spend years on a wall that fenced nothing and held back nothing, until they saw that it ran the length of the disputed reach of the creek, and that it was in its quiet way a marker, line laid down in granite to say that this water and this ground had been measured true and would stay measured true, and that the woman who laid it knew exactly where every line ran. People asked her sometimes why she had been so sure there was a door. She never gave them the whole answer, because the whole answer was her father, and the dust in his lungs, and the sentence about never letting a man tell her what she could not lift, and those were not things to hand to a stranger in the street. She gave them the small, true answer instead. She said that a mountain that comes down along lines, and that if you are patient enough to read the lines, you can always find the one thing the mountain meant to keep, and that the men who laughed had only ever looked at the pile and never once at the way it was holding itself together. Granny V died 2 winters later, in her soddy, with her good garden going to seed outside, and Ruth Bell came north for the burying and stood beside Hannah at the grave, and afterward the 2 women walked up to the creek and looked at the wall. The water ran clear and senior and undisputed past the fitted stone. Ruth said her father would have liked to see it. Hannah said she thought her own father would have liked the wall, the dry-laid joints of it, the way it would stand 100 years without a dab of mortar, because it was built to listen to the weight instead of fight it. They did not say much more than that. There was not much more that needed saying. What did you believe in that no one else would believe with you until you had to prove it with your own hands? Hold on to that. And if this is the kind of story that stays with you, the kind where the thing the world threw away turns out to hold the truth that sets it right, there are others like it waiting. The surveyor's chain hung by the door of the house Hannah built for herself that next spring, on a peg where she could reach it. 66 feet of bright worn, iron coiled small. She did not use it often. On still evenings she would sometimes take it down and run it through her hands, link by link, the way you touch a thing to remember what it measured. And the iron was always cold against her palm, the particular cold of a thing that has been carrying a weight for a long time. And she would hang it back on its peg and stand a moment in the doorway and look up the valley toward the mountain that had tried to keep it secret and had not been patient enough, in the end, to outlast a woman who knew how to listen to stone.